Hey, everyone. This is Adam Borstein, senior reporter at STAT, and welcome to this week's installment of STAT Plus Conversations. It's our weekly exclusive video chat series for STAT Plus subscribers. I'm going to talking to Paul Matisse, managing director of and biotechnology analyst at Stifel. Today, we'll be talking about CNS drugs. But before we get to it, let me do a little housekeeping. I'm sure all you guys are very familiar with Zoom these days. At the bottom of the screen, there's a chat feature. The chat feature you can use to kind of talk to our back folks who are kind of back of house running this thing in case you have any questions. Don't put any questions in the chat, though, because I won't be monitoring that as closely. If you do want to ask questions today, and I hope you do, I definitely will be taking questions, and we can throw a lot of questions at Paul. There's a Q&A box. Just type those questions into the Q&A box, and I'll go through those, over the course of this 45-minute conversation, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. We are very appreciative of the sponsors to our Stat Plus conversation. This month in April, Stat Plus is being sponsored by Metadata, Acorn AI. And with that said, I would like to introduce the president of Acorn AI at Metadata, and that is Sastry Chilukuri. Sastry, take it away.
Thank you, Adam. Look, we at Metadata and Dassault Systems and Acorn are super excited to be sponsoring the series with Stat Plus. And CNS is a highly relevant topic for us. For those of you who don't know, Dassault Systems, which is our parent company, is now the world's largest life science tech company, with the combination of BioVia as well as Metadata. And Metadata runs more than half of the electronically captured clinical trials, and it's the platform where majority of the data is currently captured coming out of clinical trial research. And Acorn AI is the data science business of Metadata. And what we build are analytic products on top of this really rich trove of data that we've been capturing over the last 10 plus years. And our innovations include both trial operational analytics that allow you to be able to optimize site selection as well as monitor the execution of clinical trials, as well as around the use of synthetic control arms and external controls for regulatory submission, as well as an internal use. Specifically, given CNS is the topic for today, I wanted to highlight a few of the really interesting innovations that we're seeing on our side, some of which are about to be published soon, in terms of the use of AI and advanced analytics to be able to make trials move faster, as well as avoid some of the challenges that prior trials have faced in this space. We all know the graveyard of trials that exist here. The one big area of innovation that we have, especially around Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, is to be able to better identify patients who are at risk and not risk of dropout, to be able to ensure that trials are completed on time. It's certainly a big area that we're seeing. The second is we're looking at historic trial data to be able to understand better endpoints beside the FDA mandated endpoints, to be able to better understand which drugs in phase 2 are worth moving forward to phase 3 and beyond as predictors of success. And then lastly, with this increasing use of sensors and the wide set of instruments that are now available, we're trying to build correlations between the information that's coming out of those along with the clinical trial data to be able to find novel biomarkers. This is all the innovation that we're supporting, along with all the innovation that we're starting to see happen in terms of the molecules and the pathways that are getting targeted, all of which lead us to believe that we probably have a pretty exciting decade of CNS drugs ahead of us. With that, why don't I turn it back to Adam, and I'm really excited to see what the panel has to say today.
Sastry, thanks so much. All right, let's bring on Paul Matisse. Paul.
What's up, man? How you doing?
How are you?
Good.
I haven't seen Paul in a long time because of COVID.
I know. What, did we have a beer like 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, no, it's been a while.
Yeah.
So Paul, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Tell everyone a little bit about what you do, maybe a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks so much, Adam. So I'm a stock analyst at an investment bank, which means I follow 25 or so companies and have investment ratings on them, and try to do research and try to kind of dig into issues and figure out if drugs are going to work, which is super hard, and you're kind of wrong a lot, but you try to do research that adds value and that investors kind of want to read and engage with you about. And within the context of that, one of my areas of focus is neuroscience. I've been covering the space for a while, and before I worked on Wall Street, I worked in a neurology lab. So it's great. I've definitely been lucky to kind of ride the hype tailwind in CNS, so to speak, but there's also been a lot of setbacks too, and still a lot of unmet need, but a lot of complexity.
Yeah, I think one of the things I appreciate about you and your coverage is, again, that's specialization. You are focused on CNS. It's a really fascinating area. It's not cancer, which everyone else seems to be focused on. So it's nice to find analysts who are really fluent in these areas and do a really great job of explaining complicated issues like you do. So I look forward to reading your notes when they come out. So I feel like this probably, we can't start a conversation about CNS or neuropsychiatry or any of this stuff without starting to talk about aducanumab, right? Biogen's Alzheimer's drug. It's I think this is a requirement. We have to start this conversation about that. So Paul, what's going on? The FDA has this drug. They've had the data now 9 months. I did a little math. 9 months already. What's going on inside the FDA?
Yeah,
with respect to aducanumab.
So first of all, I have utterly no idea, and I think I've never understood the people on Wall Street who are either think this is extremely likely to get approved or extremely unlikely. Because I actually think
it's a pretty polarizing.
The right move here is to change your mind a million times because it's so hard. I think it's hard. I don't think it should be approved, first of all, but I think it might be, and if I had to guess what was going to happen tomorrow, I still kind of think it's more likely than not for a couple of reasons. So one, I've never seen a division head and a director. And just for the context here, there was this panel in the fall and a panel of experts voted against approval, but the FDA affirmed that they really believe Biogen's depiction of the data. They really want something for Alzheimer's, and they think this drug is super safe. And coming out of that, our view was that it's going to be politically challenging for the FDA to approve this drug unless they have a mechanism by which to say that they considered the panel, right? So them extending the approval action date, saying they were considering new analyses, additional data, to me, that leans more towards approval than not. But I think the counter case, and one of the other things that we might talk about that investors are kind of wondering is, we have an interim commissioner at the FDA. So are they kicking the can down the road? And I think it's kind of an unvettable situation. And this goes back to kind of, for those listening, when you're an industry analyst, you have to try to merge it with being a stock analyst and think, okay, what do I think the probability is for aducanumab being approved relative to what I think a stock price is? And, that in itself is also subjective, right? But, but it's funny, right? Because I'm buy rated on Biogen, and I don't think this drug should be approved. But
so we step back a second and we think back to November. The FDA panel happened, right? It was bad. It was bad for, if you were a Biogen bull, if you were an aducanumab believer, that was a bad panel. It was basically a unanimous recommendation not only against the approval of the drug, but the panel essentially really went after the FDA in the way that the FDA kind of, right.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward to January, where they extended the PDUFA date. So they extended the review. It was supposed to be March 7th, and they gave it, they're taking another 3 months. So now the PDUFA date is June 7th to review what they said. Those more clinical data. Right. So we're in that. So we're in that window now, right? March 7th has passed. It's April. What do you think the FDA is doing? If you were inside the FDA, if you were in Billy Dunn's office, Billy Dunn runs the neuroscience division, who's running this review. What's going on there? What are they doing right now?
I have no idea. I really don't know, right? On a run at the gym? No, in all seriousness, look, so Biogen has this other study that's ongoing, right? Where they resume dosing.
And that's the Embark study.
Exactly. They're going to be able to get efficacy data from that trial. There's so much experience now in Alzheimer's with historical placebo arms and natural history and things like that, where you can probably contextualize efficacy data from that study. You also have PET, right? You have the actual plaque data, which is one of the explanations, right, for the discordant results between the two trials. I don't know if I totally buy that, but the FDA did. So I think there are ways, like if you were a believer in their original phase 3s, there's certainly a lens through which you could look at this additional data, right? And again, if you're going to approve this drug, the only way you can do it that's politically tenable is if you say there's kind of new information that you're considering, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's an analysis to do that. I think you and I kind of see the data science side of this similarly, right? Where it is a little bit absurd, right? I mean, the FDA is looking at single arm data in Alzheimer's, like to decide whether or not they're going to approve the first Alzheimer's drug. Like, I don't know if I agree with that, but I think that's probably the context, because I guess
I mean, I think there's been this conjecture or chatter about a conditional approval or a restricted, like there's it's sort of like an approval with an asterisk or an approval with some sort of caveat. But what mechanism does the FDA have to do something like that?
Yes, because that exists in oncology where you can do biomarker-driven approvals.
Right.
Here, you have to approve this based on amyloid reduction, right? And then say do a clinical study. Because, in the EU, you can actually you can do a conditional approval and ask for another trial. In the US, if you're approving it on clinical benefit, my understanding is it's kind of full approval or not. So then you think, okay, well, what would be a restricted population? I mean, there's not much you can do beyond the trial, right? Mm-hmm. Cognitive impairment, amyloid positive. So I don't know. I kind of think it's hard for the FDA to like thread the needle here, in my opinion. Like, I think you either have to kind of go for it and be ready for the backlash, or just say give us a tiebreaker trial, right? I don't know what the third scenario is, even though I've heard people speculating about it.
So we have a question, Sophie Snyder. Thanks for your question, and folks, get your questions in. I don't see many questions in there, so I want more questions in the box. So type away. But she says that, equity research, the job that you do, is focused a lot on clinical outcomes. And they generally don't consider market access as much, particularly for CNS therapy. So let's sort of spin this conversation forward, and let's say that the FDA approves aducanumab. What sort of market access, patient access do you think this drug gets? Do insurers become the gating factor here?
Yeah, I don't think so. I actually do have a gating factor for you, because I think there actually is something interesting about this drug launch that might make it a lot more restricted than the kind of big time bulls think. But I mean, I do. So to be clear, I mean, look, I believe that, I think the political and sociological side of the access discussion is extremely important. It is outside of the purview of my job. But I do think a lot about payers, right? And when forecasting a drug, what are patients going to be asked to try first, right? What is the out-of-pocket cost going to be, and how will that impact human behavior and kind of basic economics? In the context of Alzheimer's, I think it's going to be really, really, really hard for insurers to not reimburse the drug for the per label population, right? I mean, because I guess the question would be, what's your prior auth requirement? Is your prior auth requirement that you're still getting worse despite trying Aricept and Namenda? Mm-hmm. It's everybody, right? So I kind of think the access would align with the label. I think the difficulty with this drug specifically, and I don't know how you think about this if you do the FDA, is it's going to be so hard to use, right?
Explain that. Why?
So it's a once monthly infusion, but that's not even the big deal, because there's infusions in neurology everywhere, like in MS. The big deal is you're going to need to do a PET scan to confirm the presence of amyloid, right? The pathogenic protein in the brain, pre-treatment. And then you're going to need to do MRIs. In the trial, it was 6 MRIs in the first year. So I don't know who's gotten an MRI on here, maybe most people. And my wife actually works for an insurance company. And, whose plan reimburses what for one MRI and where they want you to go is all over the place, right? I don't know who's going to pay for what bill. Are you going to go to the right center to get the MRI? We talked to one neurologist one time who said that every MRI he gets from elsewhere says that there's ARIA on it, right? And the reason why they have to do these MRIs is to look for this thing that's been named ARIA, imaging related abnormality, but is like
it's the main side effect of
subclinical brain swelling, right? So I think the complexity of managing that is going to relegate this to a much, much smaller population. It could still be a big drug if Biogen prices it a certain way, but I think this drug specifically is extremely hard to forecast, not because of payer dynamics or how good of a drug it is. It's because of that, and there being really no analogs.
What do you model for this?
Am
I putting you on the spot? What's your model say?
No.
What's your model say?
If this gets approved, we have it being like a $5 to $6 billion drug, you know, and I think.
And what kind of penetration is that? It's
really small. You know, it's confined to MCI, and you're probably talking about like at a given time, right? 10% of patients, you know, I mean, because, you know, we did this panel in January where we basically had a couple of neurologists on who were at major academic centers. And what they said to us and a group of investors was, you know, there's only about 100 of us in the US who can realistically give this drug. And we actually don't even know within our practices if all this downstream management is going to actually make us lose money, right? So I think the logistical barriers of this, unfortunately, kind of getting back to the sociological side of the access issue, might make this sort of a boutique product for people with means and a lot of resources. If it gets.
So one last question on this, although maybe we'll get back to it later, but do you think it's going to go down to the wire? Do you think that we're going to get, like, are we all going to be clicking refresh on June 7th?
Yeah.
Or is it going to come earlier than that?
I think so.
June 7th is what you think?
I have no idea other than neuro. The only early decision I can remember is Spinraza. Everything else has come down to the wire. And in neuro, they've even been late enough to do this. So I think it'll come down to the wire. In oncology, they act early all the time.
So let's move on. And actually, this is a good springboard. So Karina asks, a question came in. What indications do you think the neuroscience field will be working on over the next 10 years outside of Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
And I think it's good because I think you're a big proponent of kind of this, what you call the sort of the what do you call it? The geneticization of neuroscience. I can't say geneticization, but that's kind of a big theme of your work.
Yeah, it is. And so, look, I mean, I don't want to sound like a PR person for neurology, because at the end of the day, everything's more complicated than this, right? But if you go back to oncology, which Adam, you know much better than me, the big breakthroughs in a lot of cancer types, like lung cancer, right, came when via genetics, you were able to take populations and not define them by lung cancer, but define them by the genetic mutation that drives their tumor. And I think we're starting to see this in neurology, and that's, I think, going to be a big driver of drug development. So take Parkinson's, for example. A number of different genetic mutations now have arisen that all center around lysosomal function and the ability of cells to clear waste and debris and pathogens. Similar to frontotemporal dementia, similar to ALS, right, where it's got its own different genetic subsets. And even in Alzheimer's, we now have one of the first kind of genetically informed targets, TREM2, being tested by Alector and AbbVie. And I know when I say the first, people will say, okay, amyloid had a genetic bent. And that's true, but I think the amyloid genetic bent was really in these very kind of rare subpopulations where TREM2 mutations are not that uncommon. So I think that's kind of the future of this space, right? And, you know, I talked to a big executive from one of these neurology companies a few years ago who was working on A-beta stuff and tau stuff. And he said to me that in 30 or 40 years, he thinks these diseases might have different names. They might be redefined, right? Because the reality is Alzheimer's, if you get diagnosed—
So we won't have Parkinson's or Huntington's or ALS. We'll have some sort of subset of those diseases.
Because I think the challenge has been these diseases are just so heterogeneous, right? If you get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you know, you could live for another 20 years, or it could be another 3. And it's harder to believe that those are the same disease, you know? And separately, these diseases were kind of originally sort of defined by misfolded proteins in the brain, right? And that delineated Alzheimer's versus Parkinson's. And now there's a greater appreciation that if you look for the Parkinson's protein in Alzheimer's patients on autopsy, you actually might find it, right? So that might be even a different kind of way of thinking about this stuff. So it's all evolving, and I'm sure we'll get into other genetic stuff, so I won't anticipate it.
What particularly excites you? I mean, you know, pick a disease, pick a genetic approach. What do you think
Yeah.
is really cool these days?
So I think some of the work that's going on in ALS is really compelling. You know, ALS, there's two genetic subtypes. SOD1 is one of them. C9orf72 is another. These are the names of different driver mutations of disease. Biogen,
and SOD1 is the Biogen has a drug for that.
Exactly, and they actually have one too for C9orf72 as well. That's going to have data later this year. So I think those are really, really interesting. I think in Parkinson's disease, there's focus on this population with these mutations, LRRK2 and also GBA, which are both related to lysosomal function. And then I would have to say in frontotemporal dementia as well. I think the tough thing that we have with some of these other targets that have emerged, like TREM2 and Alzheimer's, which is a hot one. This is a neuroinflammation target that if you have a mutation in it, you have a 3 to 4-fold higher risk of Alzheimer's. Is the leader in that space is taking that target and still focusing on the all-comers Alzheimer's population. Mm-hmm. So really, when we think about genetics, it's not just the underlying biological validation, but it's the patient selection too. That's really, I think, important for.
Well, I was going to ask you, like, how do they go about diagnosing or detecting these mutations and identifying the patients? Is that, I mean, I'm familiar with that in the oncology world, but how does it work in the CNS world?
It's hard. You have to you have to change behavior, right? I mean, there's really nothing. There's nothing that special about it, right? I mean, you got to focus on the high quality centers and the key opinion leaders who really believe in the essence of what you're doing. And the difficulty is finding patients early enough, right? Because in neurology, especially, I know this is the same in other diseases too, but in neurology especially, there's kind of this existential question surrounding window of intervention, right? And in Alzheimer's, some of the pathological changes in the brain happened 20 years before. So you really want to find these patients early. And it's not easy. I think for some of these mutations, like the really rare ones, it can take a very long time to enroll a clinical trial, right? But,
so with ALS, so let's think about ALS. So SOD1 is one of these mutations in ALS. Like, how prevalent is that?
2%.
So 2% of ALS patients.
Really, really rare.
So like how many patients is that? Like, do you have any idea?
Like 600 patients in the US, man. Mm-hmm. Very rare, it's very rare. And C9orf72, the other one is bigger. It's 8 to 10%. Mm-hmm. And actually, if it works, there's good rationale to try it in frontotemporal dementia too, because there's actually overlap in that genetic genotype phenotype. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these are rare, right? I mean, you might.
So the Biogen drug in SOD1 ALS is called tofersen, right?
Yep.
And it's kind of been in the news the last few weeks because of the patient who unfortunately wasn't unable to get into the clinical trial and has kind of has sort of petitioned Biogen to get compassionate use of the drug, and that's been an issue. It's been in the news lately. We've covered it. Other people have covered it. Yeah. But there's a phase 3. Now, what do you know about that phase 3, and like what's the timing, and what's your thoughts on whether this drug works or not?
Yeah, look, it's not a huge trial, right? I think it's fewer than 100 patients, but they ran a small study earlier that seemed to show a real effect, right? And especially in patients that were faster progressors. I think the effect size on this scale, this ALS rating scale, was pretty big. It was about 3 to 4x what people call even as like clinically meaningful, right? So, I think the risk is that in that early study, you had a lot of variability and things like that. But what I like about SOD1, right, is the biology is pretty clear cut. There's not a lot of debate that this is a pathogenic protein and you want to knock it down. And Biogen is pursuing this technology that targets gene expression at the cellular level. And that technology has had some hits in CNS, like with Spinraza and spinal muscular atrophy, and some misses like in Huntington's. But ALS is a spinal cord disease, and it should be, I think, easier to kind of administer the drug to the site. So I think it's got a good shot. The other piece of it too that people point to, Adam, from the early trial is they have good data on this biomarker that has emerged in neurology called neurofilament. And, without getting too in the weeds on it, there's a lot of hype and excitement about this in the neuro industry side, because it's really the first time we have a biomarker that is agnostic to mechanism and might actually track outcomes better. And you don't have to look at it in the CNS. You can look at it in plasma. So the corroboration with that biomarker, I think, made that earlier data more believable.
So I wanted to switch so I can talk about Huntington's. because it's a disease,
Yeah.
I know in a report you put out a big report about a year ago. I think it was March of 2020, kind of a big CNS report, and you identified Huntington's as kind of one of the big new hot areas. And we've recently had some pretty significant setbacks in Huntington's.
Yeah.
Two different programs, one from Roche Ionis and the other from Wave, have both suffered some setbacks. Can you kind of go over that and what you think is going on in Huntington's?
I think there's a few things, right? I think the Wave thing you kind of have to segregate because this was an emerging company that, hadn't yet made a drug that really had all that great target engagement. So I don't think it failed because of the biology, but the Roche Ionis program, right? Roche made a huge investment in that.
And there was a lot of hope.
A lot of hope,
Yeah.
and I think so. It illuminates that there's this dream case that CNS is the next oncology, but that we're not totally there yet, right? And I'll say why in a couple of ways. So we have to kind of try to guess why that failed. I think one of the problems with Huntington specifically is that in CNS we have a lot of genetic foundation now for new targets, but we still sometimes don't really understand what's wrong, right? So for Huntington's, just like there's been in Alzheimer's, there's actually even debates within which protein is toxic with Huntington's. And this drug, it was a little bit under the radar, but this drug actually inhibited the production of one specifically, right? So it's possible the genetics are right, but the target is right. And the second thing is that Huntington's is a whole brain disease, including the deep brain. And they were administering this drug kind of near the spinal fluid. And we don't know if this drug was really engaging the target in the right areas of the brain. You kind of had to bridge from non-human primate studies. And by the way, those primate studies, they actually weren't incredible, And then I think the last thing is with some of these new technologies in CNS, antisense drugs, gene therapy, we're still understanding things about therapeutic index and safety, right? And this was a big dose of drug. There had been some safety signals in the earlier trial. So when I kind of look at the implications for Huntington's, I still look at Huntington's as a really compelling disease where you've got autosomal dominant genetics, clearly a bad actor. But I think we're going to have to think about how we're modulating it and maybe even how we're delivering drug. And so Alnylam has got a follow-up program there with Regeneron. And, they're very sophisticated, right? They're thinking about all these things and trying to learn from it. And, unfortunately, with some of these CNS diseases, we just might not hit it on the first try.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what, given sort of the failure or the setbacks, because we still don't really understand or know what exactly happened with the Roche drug. But, I mean, what other programs are out there, do you think?
Yeah, so there is, there's this Unicure program, which is a gene therapy program.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you about that, right? Yeah.
I actually think it's like really interesting, right? I mean, look, it's high risk, right? It's gene therapy.
And how does that work?
Well, so what's really interesting about this, right, is again, Huntington's is this disease where if you have the genetic mutation, sadly, you get the disease. The genetic mutation makes a protein. This protein is believed to be toxic. So everyone wants to kind of get rid of the toxic protein. The Unicure program mechanistically is kind of agnostic to that earlier issue that I alluded to, where there's multiple toxic proteins. They've actually found a target that can lower the levels of both of them, which is pretty cool. The second thing is that they're surgically administering this to the deep brain, which is the kind of area of earliest pathology in Huntington's where you get really fast brain atrophy. So those who are theorizing about the Roche Ionis failure are theorizing that maybe they didn't get enough drug to the deep brain. And then, surgical administration is so cumbersome, but Unicure's drug may be one and done, right? It's going to perpetually make the thing that actually inhibits the gene from making the protein. So once you get it, it should be durable. And, we'll get some early data later this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, when do we see data? We see it this year?
So we're going to get data in the fourth quarter of this year. They've passed some safety reviews from this trial. And then there's some other companies focusing on other targets, but I think Unicure is kind of the next high profile one.
So we've talked a little bit about the FDA with respect to aducanumab, but we're getting some questions, a bunch of questions, as you probably are not too surprised about just overall, like, WTF FDA, like what's going on? Obviously in your world, the rejection of Acadia's Nuplazid. Nuplazid, I don't know, but however you pronounce it, whatever. Pimavanserin in dementia-related psychosis, right? It just got rejected. Prior to that, they had that weird communications. So, is the FDA more conservative? What do you think? What's your take on?
I think yes, but I think this whole thing is a little bit overhyped, to be honest. Like, I think the bigger issue is just the number of companies that are saying that they've been blindsided, right? If one company says that, you never know if they're telling the truth.
Right. And Acadia made a strong argument that they were completely blindsided by this FDA thing.
I think that's the issue, right? And my hope is that when we get a permanent commissioner and the FDA gets out of kind of COVID emergency zone, that the transparency at least will come back. In terms of the conservatism, that's like the hot take right now, that the FDA is more conservative. I don't know. I mean, I honestly think as much, like I thought pimavanserin was going to get approved, and not because I thought the data were great. I actually didn't really think the efficacy data were that good. But they had breakthrough. It was a safe drug. It was for dementia. Like it was kind of, and management was so positive. It was hard to kind of disagree with them, right? But their phase 2 study that they got breakthrough on, at the time when we wrote about that, we had kind of thought it was in spirit a failed trial, right? So, and then you look at some of the other examples that surprise people. BioMarin's gene therapy, Valrox for hemophilia A. That had some good data, but it was a small sample, and hemophilia A is a well-treated disease. Or the Intercept drug in NASH, which a colleague of mine covers, has had some safety baggage. So in some sense, like there's been a lot of things that have surprised investors, but in another sense, when you look at some of these drugs, it's not, I think the good thing that biotech investors should think about is that, if you're investing in something with high quality data and a big unmet need, I don't think any of the recent developments kind of change the way you should think about the prospects of that getting to market. Like I really don't. I think if we see something that's really high quality that doesn't get through for just reasons that make no sense, then I would start to get more worried.
And this is not necessarily like a CNS question or a neuroscience question, but just on sort of FDA, the importance of having a commissioner. I mean, right now we have an interim commissioner, even though it's Janet Woodcock who basically runs the place, right? Anyway, even for years, or helped run a place. What's your thoughts on kind of, as you talk to investors, like who do they want to? I mean,
they definitely want.
Who do they want to be the FDA commissioner?
They want Janet Woodcock because I think, look, the known entity is always better than the unknown, right? I mean, I think markets, and the stock market hates opacity and uncertainty more than it even hates a negative reality, right? So if it was her, I think people would really, really like that, right? Because I think she's viewed as someone who is for getting drugs to market, for working with industry, right? And I think the fear, like the hope, if you go back to kind of a year ago when the pandemic started, right? And then, it was kind of this crisis mode for everyone in their personal lives, crisis mode in the markets, right? And stocks selling off. And I think as investors digested this for biotech, there was actually a view that, maybe this, and I don't want to say this in any level of insensitivity, but maybe this will actually help people appreciate the kind of power of innovation in biotech, right? And then in that case, the best case scenario happened. We have, vaccines with almost widespread availability in Massachusetts 13 months later. I think investors are worried that politicians may have a short-term memory and the anti-industry rhetoric might ramp up, that someone in the FDA might come in who's not very friendly to industry. So if Janet Woodcock is the head of the FDA, like that would definitely be a win in the backdrop of those fears.
So do you think, analysts love to use the word read through almost as much as clearing event. That's your other favorite word. But,
yeah, right.
Clearing event is a good one. We love that one.
Sell-side analysts who reframe bad news as clearing events.
Right. But read through. So is there any read through, to use that phrase, from the Acadia rejection to any other prominent CNS regular? Obviously aducanumab, I think Karuna, people have talked about that. Axome, anything else? Alkermes, any other?
So it's interesting, right? Like people have been asking a lot lately, right? Like now is CNS infected with this FDA conservatism? I still don't think so, because if you look at the behavior of this division, right? The crazy thing with Acadia is that you go back to when they got breakthrough, like everyone was different, right? The head of the division was different, the deputy was different. We didn't have this office of neuroscience. So if you go back to some of the decisions this division has made in recent history, I still think they align with kind of the historical case in neurology for flexibility, right? There was an ALS drug approved with one positive study and one negative study. I can never say the name, but I think it was called Daverone. ITCI's drug, lumateperone, was approved on one failed phase 3, one positive phase 2. So the other patterns recently from this division still suggest that they're willing to kind of be flexible and consider the fact that neurology is risky. And I think for Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's psychosis, like Karuna and those other companies, Axsome, people would have been worried if they rejected the Acadia drug because of safety, because that would have been okay. They don't want to approve an antipsychotic in the elderly. But the fact that it was for efficacy issues that, while they had breakthrough, had been well described, I think it makes it seem to investors like it's more insulated to that drug.
So someone asks, and it's a good question because how is the Unicure, getting back to Unicure, how is that approach different from Voyager?
Yeah, good question. So, and to be clear, I'm a little bit less familiar with Voyager, and I think they might be on clinical hold right now. And so,
yeah, and is that partnered? Is Voyager?
No, the Huntington's thing is not partnered. They actually, I think, got it back, and they did some kind of restructuring on it, right? But the difference. Well, the difference is there's two differences, right? And the implications of one of them is a little bit unvettable, to be honest. But the one difference, right, is if you go back to kind of what I was talking about multiple flavors of Huntington protein and what could be toxic, the Unicure one, again, like I said, is agnostic to that scientific debate. I believe the Voyager one is specific to the Huntington protein subtype that Roche and Ionis were going after.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it'll fail because they're probably going to do direct delivery too, but maybe one added risk. And then separately, Unicure is using AAV5, which is a vector that delivers the kind of gene therapy to the brain that, whether you like it or you don't like it, it's pretty well understood from a safety perspective. I think the Voyager delivery mechanism, it has, I think, less human experience. So that's not necessarily bad, right? Because some of the ones we have great human experience with, we have a lot of experience to know that they're bad, right? But I think there might be a little bit less data depicted.
So another question, someone wanted to know your thoughts, if you have any, on chronic pain in CNS. Do you cover chronic pain?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there's just not a lot of activity there. Not a lot of activity there. Vertex has a program, right, which has been weird because it's felt like Vertex has just been sort of slow playing it. Like they had good data and not to try another drug, and it's almost like do they want to launch a drug there, or do they want to get a portfolio of molecules to sell to someone else, right? It's a big unmet need, but the difficulty in pain, right, is separating efficacy from safety, right?
Yeah, because the sort of the part two of the question was about endpoints and how you sort of.
What I was really trying to say is that in pain, right, the unmet need is drugs that are not abusable, right? But it's hard, right? If you and I were thinking of how to develop a drug, Adam, how do we develop a drug that gets rid of pain, but like doesn't make people feel better and want to take more of it, right? We're sort of threading the needle between, ameliorating pain, but also not having this kind of addictive potential. And that's been everyone's challenge, right? And then from a clinical risk perspective, yeah, the endpoints are tough. You have these pain rating scales that are very subjective. There's big placebo effects. It's not unlike other areas of CNS. But I think from an innovation perspective, it's been a little bit more challenging to have something that's kind of differentiated.
So we've gone 40 minutes and talked to CNS, and we haven't mentioned Sage yet. So we should. Yeah. If Jeff Jonas is watching this, he's mad that we haven't talked about him yet.
Great. Yeah. Go ahead.
So yesterday we had the data on the essential tremor drug. I think your conclusion was basically like everyone's, is that the tolerability left a lot to be desired.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think in their point is that it was an early study, and there are things they can do going forward, like nighttime dosing, dose titration. But I'm harder on tolerability for CNS drugs that are in the elderly, because I think tolerability quickly delves into kind of safety concerns, right? So this drug succeeded on its endpoints of lowering tremor, but there was a 38% discontinuation rate, over a 60% rate, I think, of somnolence. And when you talk about those kinds of adverse events in the elderly, you worry that there could be a risk of falls, right?
Risk of falls is a big thing. Yeah.
So it's not to say that they can't figure this out, because, dose titration, nighttime dosing can mitigate some of this stuff. But, I think the flip side of that, right, if you're going to be a cynic, is drugs tend to not get safer as you give them to more people, right?
Mhm.
So I think you can kind of see it as both ways. And for us, again, going back to the stock, Sage's next readout is this big depression study.
Yep.
It was hard to see this kind of early data in tremor that, you know, had some positives, but had some things that were red flags as really changing the narrative going into that.
So yeah, so talk a little bit about the zuranolone and the phase 3 study. The water, I always get mixed up their waterfall, right? They have crazy names for their studies, but this was the waterfall study. This is sort of like the make or break. Study for zuranolone in depression, right? Major depressive disorder.
Right. So full disclosure for everyone who's listening here, I've been, I guess, right on Sage 50% of the time and wrong 50% of the time.
Congratulations.
Because I've always believed in this drug, and
that makes you a great analyst.
That makes me an excellent stock analyst, right? So so basically, right, Sage has had a positive phase 2 with this antidepressant drug, a positive phase 3, but it was in postpartum depression. And there's some kind of discussion on how similar is that to kind of run-of-the-mill depression. And then a failed phase 3 in depression that, you know, took the stock down 80% from its highs, I think, at one point. So they've got now another study in major depressive disorder, right? And I guess the reason why we've been optimistic is really that we think that failed study, as far as failed studies go in depression, was just not that bad. I mean, they just missed at one time point. If you go back to like Prozac, one of the most widely used antidepressants ever, I mean, it failed in 5 out of 9. And some of those failures were drug and placebo on top of each other. So I still really think this drug works. They're running a very well-powered trial. They've enriched it for more severe patients, which ironically is good because you actually have more room to kind of show a benefit, and they've increased the dose. I think the tough thing is that even if this drug does work, even if I'm correct, there's still probably a 60 to 65% probability of success just based on numbers in depression. But I think the Sage holders are hoping that, you know, if you're thinking about this as a stock, there's more upside than downside because they still do have 2 more trials after this that are funded, right? So if this fails, it's going down a lot, don't get me wrong, but there still will be one other shot. And this division of the FDA has been willing to approve drugs with positives and negatives.
So let's end this on just speaking of, we talked about obviously the aducanumab PDUFA date coming up. We got the Sage phase 3 waterfall study coming up. What other like events, you know, CNS, like what else are you looking at in terms of like, you know, catalysts coming up?
So, you know, schizophrenia has kind of heated up with Karuna, as you mentioned. There's another company in that space, Cerevel, Boston, Cambridge based, that has got
that's Tony Cole's company, right?
Tony Cole's company, Tony Cole's the man. You know, they have data mid-year for their drug that is mechanistically similar to the Karuna drug with some tweaks that kind of, you know, create some debate as to whether or not it's going to work. You know, there's some stuff going on in the epilepsy space too. Xenon's got a new mechanism epilepsy drug. Stoke is pursuing Dravet in epilepsy that's gotten some attention. The ALS drugs that I mentioned from Biogen. And then Denali is a company that has really made a lot of buzz with this blood-brain barrier delivery program for the neurological side of a rare disease called Hunter syndrome. And they have more data mid-year that is pretty important to people because it's looking at that biomarker I mentioned called neurofilament. And some investors are looking at that biomarker data as kind of a referendum as to whether or not the initial results of this were as good as they seem. So definitely a lot happening.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. So, Paul, you were awesome. So thank you.
Thanks, man.
We're going to have you on the podcast.
I'll do it anytime.
This was your like audition for the podcast.
Sounds good. I've never done a podcast.
So we'll have you on the podcast one of these days. Maybe when the aducanumab decision comes down.
Okay. I'd love to. I don't know what mood I'll be in, but it'll be interesting either way.
All right. Well, listen, Paul, thanks so much for your time today. It was really appreciated and really informative. So thank you. And to my audience, to our audience, Stats audience here, thank you so much for tuning in. As you know, we do these Stat Plus conversations every Tuesday, 1:00 Eastern time. Next week, April 20th, my colleague, Katie Palmer, is going to be sitting down with Othman Laraki and Carolyn Savelto of Color, and they're going to be talking about building infrastructure for population health. So until then, we will sign off. Thanks very much for